March 22nd, 1945. Deep behind German lines, amidst the burning wreckage of American Sherman tanks and the agonizing screams of dying soldiers bleeding out in the freezing Bavarian mud, a horrifying, sickening realization is spreading through the surviving men of Task Force Baum. They have been betrayed. Not by cunning enemy spies, not by a tragic tactical miscalculation at headquarters, and certainly not by the politicians back in Washington who drew the maps. They have been betrayed by the very man they worshipped, the man they would have gladly followed into the deepest fires of hell. General George S. Patton, the most legendary blood and guts commander of the United States military, the terrifying architect of the Third Army's relentless march across Europe, has just sent 300 of his own men on a suicide mission that makes absolutely no strategic sense to anyone on the blood-soaked battlefield. As the German panzers close in from all sides, their tracks churning the earth as they maneuver to finish off the trapped Americans, the desperate whisper among the exhausted troops is that their commanding general has committed an act of treason. Type the word betrayal in the comments right now if you are ready to uncover the darkest, most heavily censored, and most morally devastating secret of George S. Patton's entire military career. Because the absolute truth of what happened in the dark, frozen forests of Hammelburg that night is not a simple story of a general selling his country out to the Nazi regime. It is something much more disturbing, much more profoundly human, and much more devastating to the mythology of American military infallibility. It is the story of a strategic genius who became so entirely consumed by his own personal, private desires that he crossed the ultimate, unforgivable moral line, sacrificing the lives of his most loyal soldiers for a completely selfish reason and triggering a massive, explosive confrontation that almost saw the greatest hero of World War II completely destroyed, court-martialed, and disgraced by his own superiors. To understand the absolute, mind-bending insanity of the order that condemned these 300 men to die, you have to look closely at the strategic reality of the Third Army in the final, frantic months of the European war. The Nazi war machine was actively collapsing, caught in the crushing vice grip between the Soviet Red Army in the east and the massive Allied coalition in the west. The Americans were pushing deep into the German homeland, preparing for the monumental crossing of the Rhine River, and the logistical mathematics of the war dictated that every single tank, every drop of precious fuel, and every combat-ready infantryman was desperately needed for the final thrust to break the enemy's back. But Patton's attention had suddenly, inexplicably, shifted away from winning the global war. According to the meticulously researched historical accounts in Martin Blumenson's definitive compilation, The Patton Papers, and Carlo D'Este's masterful biography, Patton, A Genius for War, the general had received a piece of highly classified, deeply personal intelligence. He had learned that located roughly 50 miles deep behind heavily fortified German lines, in a notorious prisoner of war facility known as Auflag 13B near the town of Hammelburg, the Germans were holding a specific American officer. That officer was Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters. He was a man captured in the disastrous sands of North Africa years prior, and more importantly, he was General George S. Patton's beloved son-in-law. Armed with this agonizing knowledge, a man who possessed the power to move mountains of steel and tens of thousands of men decided to use the United States military apparatus as his own private security firm. The planning phase of this disastrous operation, as documented in the post-war testimonies of the officers involved, was a masterclass in the abuse of absolute command authority. Patton bypassed standard operational protocols and summoned the commanders of his incredibly lethal 4th Armored Division. He demanded a rapid surgical strike force be assembled immediately to punch through the German lines, drive 50 miles into hostile, deeply defended territory, liberate the Hammelburg camp, and drive back out. When the legendary tank commander General Crichton Abrams, a man whose tactical brilliance was so profound that the modern American M1 Abrams tank is named after him, heard this plan, he was absolutely paralyzed with professional shock. Abrams, looking at the topographical maps and the known German troop concentrations, flatly told Patton that sending a tiny, unsupported force that deep into the enemy's homeland was not a military operation. It was a guaranteed execution. Abrams argued fiercely that if a rescue mission was absolutely necessary, an entire combat command of thousands of men and heavy artillery should be sent to ensure they could fight their way back out. But Patton, driven by a frantic, uncompromising personal anxiety that completely blinded his legendary tactical brilliance, aggressively overruled his most trusted commanders. He demanded a small, fast force. The burden of this doomed command fell on the shoulders of Captain Abraham Baum, a tough, battle-hardened 24-year-old Jewish officer from the Bronx who had a reputation for sheer, unbreakable grit. Baum was handed exactly 300 men, 16 Sherman and light Chaffee tanks, and 27 half-tracks. He was told to accomplish the impossible, and because he was an American soldier, he saluted and marched his men directly into the meat grinder. The execution of the Hammelburg Raid, officially designated as Task Force Baum, was exactly the suffocating, bloody nightmare that Patton's subordinate officers had predicted. On the evening of March 22, the tiny armored column violently punched a hole through the initial German front lines, their heavy guns blasting through the town of Schweinheim in a chaotic, terrifying night engagement. But the moment they pushed past the frontline crust and entered the German interior, they were entirely alone, totally isolated from Allied air support, and surrounded by a deeply paranoid, highly alerted enemy. As detailed in Richard Barron's exhaustive historical account, Raid, the untold story of Patton's secret mission, the German military command, initially confused by the tiny size of the American force, assumed it was the spearhead of a massive, multi-division offensive. General der Infanterie Otto Hitzfeld immediately mobilized entire regiments of German armor, tank destroyers, and seasoned infantry to hunt them down. Task Force Baum fought through ambush after grueling ambush, their vehicles taking heavy, devastating fire from Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets hidden in the dense, freezing Bavarian forests. The casualty numbers climbed with every agonizing mile they pushed forward. The men were fighting with the kind of desperate, terrifying courage that defined the American armored divisions, bleeding out on the steel floors of their half-tracks, believing with everything they had that they were executing a vital, high-level strategic mission that would somehow alter the entire course of the Second World War. They bled, they died, and they pushed their burning, smoking vehicles to the absolute mechanical limit until they finally smashed through the wooden perimeter wire of OFLAG 13B late in the afternoon of March 27th. But when the smoke cleared inside the freezing, overcrowded camp, the surviving American soldiers looked around, and the sickening, world-shattering truth finally hit them. There was no massive secret weapons depot hidden here. There were no high-level Nazi commanders to capture and interrogate. There was no geopolitical strategic asset that justified the horrific slaughter of their brothers in arms who were left burning in the forests behind them. There was only a camp full of starving, freezing, desperate prisoners of war, primarily Serbians and Americans, and among them was one specific, highly recognizable man, Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters. Type the word traitor in the comments right now if you can feel the absolute crushing weight of that realization hitting those frontline soldiers, the pure acid of betrayal burning in their stomachs. General Patton, the man who stood on stages in front of giant American flags and demanded absolute sacrifice, perfect duty, and selfless honor from his troops, had not sent them to win the war. He had used the United States military, the innocent blood of 300 American citizens, and the massive logistical resources of the Third Army as his own personal private rescue squad to save a member of his own family. It was an abuse of power so monumental, so deeply unethical, and so entirely selfish that it shattered the fundamental sacred trust between a combat commander and his men. The betrayal was absolute, and the consequences were instantly, terrifyingly fatal. The tragic irony of Patton's selfish gamble manifested almost immediately inside the chaotic camp. As Captain Baum's tanks rolled into the compound, the German guards, confused and panicking, began firing wildly. Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters, the very man the entire mission was designed to save, bravely volunteered to walk out toward the main gate with a white flag to negotiate a peaceful surrender of the German garrison and prevent a massacre of the starving prisoners. But as he approached the gate, a German guard who did not understand the situation raised his rifle and shot Waters point-blank in the thigh. The bullet shattered the bone, severing an artery, and dropping Patton's son-in-law into the mud, critically wounded and bleeding profusely. He was far too severely injured to be moved, let alone strapped to the back of a bouncing, retreating Sherman tank. Captain Baum, now bleeding himself from shrapnel wounds, realized the horrifying futility of the entire endeavor. They had sacrificed everything, and the man they came for could not even leave. Worse still, because Task Force Baum had made so much noise fighting their way to the camp, the German military had used the time to mobilize an overwhelming, inescapable counterattack. Entire divisions of German armor and infantry had completely encircled the Hammelburg area. The tiny American force was completely swallowed alive. The order to retreat from the camp was not a military maneuver. It was a desperate, panicked fight for simple biological survival in the darkness. Captain Baum ordered his remaining men to load as many prisoners as they could onto the surviving vehicles and attempt to break out back toward American lines. But it was completely hopeless. As they moved through the darkness toward a location known as Hill 427, the German trap snapped shut. Flare after flare illuminated the night sky, turning the American vehicles into perfect glowing targets. German Hetzer tank destroyers and Tiger tanks opened fire from elevated hidden positions, systematically blowing the remaining Sherman tanks into pieces of burning shrapnel. The American vehicles, completely out of fuel and ammunition, became iron tombs. The destruction of Task Force Baum was total and absolute. Out of the 300 men Patton sent into that forest, not a single one made it back to American lines. Every single soldier was either killed in action, severely wounded, or taken prisoner by the surrounding German forces. Every single one of the 57 vehicles was completely destroyed or captured. When the shattered, bleeding, and defeated survivors were marched back into the very same prisoner of war camp they had just tried to liberate, the resentment and pure, unadulterated hatred for their commanding general burned hotter than their hatred for the enemy guards beating them. They had been sent to die for a family favor, and in the strict, uncompromising, blood-soaked brotherhood of combat, there is absolutely no greater treason than a commander who spends the lives of his men for himself. When the news of this catastrophic, unauthorized disaster inevitably reached the desk of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the reaction was a mixture of absolute fury and deep, institutional panic. Eisenhower was dealing with the infinitely complex, high-stakes geopolitics of ending a world war, managing the delicate alliance with the advancing Soviet Union, and preparing for the occupation of Germany. Now his most famous, most brilliant, and most violently unpredictable general had just committed a massive, flagrant violation of military ethics that bordered on outright criminality. According to the memoirs of Eisenhower's staff, the Supreme Commander immediately demanded answers, pulling Patton into a brutal confrontation that threatened to strip him of his command, publicly court-martial him, and end his legendary career in total, humiliating disgrace. This was the ultimate moment of truth. What does a man who built his entire global identity on honor, glory, and unyielding military discipline say when he is caught red-handed in the ultimate act of selfish betrayal? At first, Patton did what desperate, cornered men always do. He lied through his teeth. He attempted to orchestrate a massive cover-up, officially claiming to his superiors, the Pentagon, and the rabid international press that he had absolutely no idea his son-in-law was in that specific camp. He fabricated a strategic justification, claiming that the mission was simply a chaotic attempt to liberate American prisoners, to prevent them from being moved by the retreating Germans, and to create a diversion to confuse the German High Command about the Third Army's true axis of advance. He tried desperately to frame a deeply personal abuse of power as an unfortunate, risky battlefield miscalculation. But behind closed doors, in the total, unforgiving privacy of his personal diaries, and eventually in the quiet, deeply tense conversations with his closest staff officers, Patton's arrogant, invincible facade completely cracked. He knew exactly what he had done, and the historical record proves it. In his personal journal preserved in the Library of Congress for future generations to dissect, Patton finally confessed to the dark reality of his actions. He wrote, in a moment of rare, crushing vulnerability, that sending Task Force Baum was the only true mistake he ever made during the entire European campaign. He admitted that he was driven entirely by his personal anxiety for his family, that his usually flawless strategic judgment was completely clouded by emotion, and that the guilt of those 300 destroyed men rested entirely, heavily, and permanently on his shoulders. He escaped a formal court-martial and a public execution of his career only because Eisenhower and the political establishment desperately needed his unparalleled tactical brilliance to finish the war against a fanatic, dying Germany, and because the United States government simply could not afford the massive, demoralizing public relations nightmare of putting America's most famous, most beloved combat general on trial for sacrificing his own men. The War Department buried the story, heavily censoring the press reports and sweeping the destruction of Task Force Baum under the rug of the broader victory in Europe. But the damage to his soul and to his long-term historical legacy was permanent. The men who survived the Hammelburg Raid never forgot the betrayal, and military historians have debated the morality of Patton's decision for nearly 80 years. It forces us to confront a terrifying reality about the nature of war and the men who wage it. We want our historical heroes to be perfect, flawless statues of marble, men who always make the righteous choice and put the mission above all else. But the terrifying truth is that they are human beings, carrying the exact same flaws, fears, and selfish desires as the rest of us. George S. Patton was a military genius who undeniably shortened the Second World War and saved thousands of American lives through his brilliant, aggressive maneuvers. But on March 22, 1945, he was just a terrified father-in-law who used the awesome, terrifying power of the United States military to run a personal errand, and 300 brave men paid the ultimate price for his weakness. If this deeply unsettling story completely shattered your sanitized perception of military history and showed you the terrifying, profoundly flawed humanity behind the polished legends of World War II, you cannot leave this video without hitting the like button right now. Do it not for the algorithm, not for the metrics, but to honor the 300 men of Task Force Baum, men like Captain Abraham Baum, who fought, bled, and died with absolute courage and flawless duty for an order that never, ever should have been given. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep peeling back the comfortable layers of history to uncover the brutal, uncompromising, and often deeply uncomfortable truth of what actually happened on the battlefields that shaped our world. Turn on all your notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the historical secrets the standard textbooks are simply too afraid to print. And I need you to leave your honest, unfiltered verdict in the comments down below. Was General George S. Patton a brilliant, irreplaceable commander who made one tragic, deeply human mistake under the unimaginable stress of global war? Or did this selfish, calculated sacrifice of his own troops make him a traitor to the uniform he wore and the men he commanded? I read every single comment, and that raw, honest debate is exactly why this channel exists. I will see you in the next one.